First, we are going to show you a DVD. The DVD was made by the Byzantine Center in Los Angeles, the Museum of Tolerance. In 2004, Mr. Richard Trenk, the movie director of the Byzantine Center, came to my home and interviewed me for 5 hours. But don't be afraid, the DVD will last only 10 minutes, okay? And the DVD was made for a big bash in a Beverly Hills hotel in the same year. So here is the DVD.
How does a young girl from a devoutly Orthodox Jewish family end up becoming a spy whose efforts helped to bring an earlier end to the war in Europe in 1945? The answer to that question was one that Martha Cohn, born Martha Hoffnung, kept to herself for the better part of a half-century. Born in 1920 in the French town of Metz in the Alsace region of France near the German border, Martha was one of 7 children. The family was quite religious, but at the same time mixed easily with their non-Jewish neighbors. But with war clouds on the horizon in September of 1939, the Hoffnungs and many of their Jewish neighbors decided to move to a safer part of France, away from the German border, to the town of Poitiers, southwest of Paris. However, they were not safe for long. The Nazis invaded France, and with little resistance, the French government capitulated. Immediately, life began to change.
We didn't know how bad it would be. We could not understand that, because even if we knew about Kristallnacht, it was in Germany. They did that to the Germans. They couldn't do that to the French people.
For a while, in spite of the various restrictions placed on the Jews, the Hoffnungs were able to go about their daily business. Martha started nursing school and became engaged to a young medical student. As the war progressed, and resistance to the Nazis and their Vichy French collaborators became more widespread, the family began to take more chances. Martha and her sisters hid Jews who did not have the proper papers, and her fiancé became actively involved in resistance activities. One day, French police arrested her sister Stephanie, and then her father. When her father was released shortly thereafter, the family managed to escape using false papers that did not identify them as Jews. There was a plan to help Stephanie escape from the French jail she was being held at, but sadly, it failed.
She was caught in the camp, and then later she was transferred to Drancy near Paris, and then to Pithiviers. And she wrote that they were going to be deported that afternoon, the afternoon of Yom Kippur 42.
Most of the Hoffnung family went to the mountains to join an older brother who was head of the resistance there. Martha finished her nursing studies in Marseille, occasionally getting the chance to rendezvous with her fiancé Jacques. Then, in the summer of 1943, she went to Paris to work for a month in a hospital, traveling again under her false papers. She met briefly with Jacques. He was on the run for a resistance act that led to the murder of a Nazi collaborator. She begged him to stay in hiding with her.
And I told him, you cannot go back to Poitiers. You have immediately to escape and go south and go to Spain, and I will join you. But he said, he has to go back. His family is in Poitiers. His brother is there. He will tell them goodbye and live with his brother and his friends as soon as they can. And he left after his examination. He left, and he promised me to write me every day. And 3 letters arrived, and the 4th one never came.
She soon learned that Jacques had been arrested along with his brother and several friends. He was tried and then executed for his resistance activities. Broken-hearted, Martha returned to Marseille, graduated from her nursing studies, and then moved back to Paris to work for a registry. She remained there until the Allies liberated France.
When we heard on the radio that the troops were entering Paris. All the church bells started ringing, and we opened our windows and we all sang the Marseillaise. The whole city was singing the Marseillaise.
Almost immediately after the liberation, Martha enlisted in the French army, where initially she worked as a social worker in the Alsace region of the country, close to her hometown of Metz. When her commanding officer learned that Martha spoke fluent German, he recruited her to join Army intelligence.
I was introduced to Colonel Bouvet. He told me he needs me to interrogate people, to know what's going on, to know how the strategy of the German, if they are retreating or not retreating, and how many people are there, all this military information.
After procuring information from Nazi POWs, Martha was ready for her spy mission. It involved crossing the border from Switzerland into Germany to see how entrenched the Nazis still were. She would then have to pass that intelligence on to the Allies. It took more than 13 tries, but Martha made it over the border into Germany. Her cover was that she was a German nurse trying to find out what happened to her Nazi fiancé. One day, she came upon a group of German soldiers who had retreated from the Allies.
And we were walking, and among us was a non-commissioned officer who was an SS, and he was raving about the Jews, how much he had killed Poles and Jews and all that. And he loved, and he smelled Jews a mile away. That's always what they say. He was going back to the Siegfried line. He had been wounded, and he came back from the hospital. And as we walked, he fainted. So I was a good German nurse. I took care of him.
From this SS soldier, Martha was able to obtain important information about exactly what was going on at the Nazi front lines. Making her way back to the Swiss border, she was able to transmit her report with the help of a Swiss farming family. Martha then crossed the border again and made her way back into Germany to see if there was anything else she could uncover.
I walked to the Siegfried line to see what's going on. And when I arrived at the Siegfried line, they were all gone. The last stragglers were leaving. And they told me that the Siegfried line is empty. Do you realize what an important information that was?
The information Martha uncovered helped to shorten the Allied effort to defeat the Nazis and saved untold numbers of lives. For the better part of a half-century, Martha did not talk of her experiences, even with her family. But in the mid-1990s, while visiting in France, she made a request for her French Army records. When officials at the French archives saw her file of commendations and achievements, the wheels were put into motion for her to be awarded the Médaille Militaire, one of France's highest military honors, and the same medal awarded to Sir Winston Churchill by the French government. Why was she so quiet about her exploits over the years?
It was not modesty, but I thought that nobody would believe me. Usually a spy is a very tall, good-looking woman, and I didn't feel I was that type of person at all. I was a very unlikely spy. Thank you. I want to make a comment now about this DVD. Anytime somebody is interviewed by the media, they never render things as the way you told them. And there are several errors in that DVD. One, the most important error is that my sister was not arrested by the French police. She was arrested by the SIPO, S-I-P-O. These are initials of a very long name that I cannot, in German, that I won't repeat here. But anyway, the SIPO came to the house one evening when we had dinner, and they arrested my sister for resistance acts, not because she was a Jew, because they had not started to arrest Jews, French Jews in Poitiers in June 1942. You have to understand that they had no computers yet. Nothing was centralized. So they got orders and they applied these orders the way they wanted and when they wanted. So in June 1942, they had not yet arrested French Jews, they had arrested only foreign Jews, which were in a camp on the fringe of the city of Poitiers, where we were refugees in 1942. And that was not our hometown, that was in another section of France, southwest of Paris. But my sister was taken by the Zippo to their offices and questioned, and she refused to give them the information they were requested from her. Then they came back to the house and arrested my father to put pressure on my sister to give them the information. But even in the presence of my father, she refused to give that information, because that was denouncing a farmer who was helping people to cross from occupied France to non-occupied France. I don't know how much you know about France during the occupation, but 3/4 of France were occupied by the German army, and 1/4 was under the government of Marshal Pétain, who was supposedly, because I never believed that, but supposedly a big hero of World War I in Verdun. But that's history. I don't know how much history of Europe you know. But anyway, Marshal Pétain was collaborating 100% with the Germans. So all the French people who did not accept to be occupied by the Germans, who were resisted, did not accept to be commanded by Marshal Pétain. But the police state was so strong, it was extremely dangerous to be a resistant. Anyway, 75% of French Jews, in France, survived the occupation of France. And that is because so many non-Jews helped us to survive. And any act of these people helping us was risking their lives and that of all members of their family. Now, I like to ask young people always that question. The older people don't care, but the young people, think 1 minute, would you be able to help other people survive by risking your own life and that of members of your family? You don't need to answer me, but just think about that. So after that, yeah, so my father was arrested too, to put pressure on her. She refused to give that information, and my father was released, because I told you that French Jews had not yet been arrested. My sister was 1 month in prison. She celebrated her 21st birthday in prison on July 10th, 1942. And after that month of prison, she was transferred to that camp on the fringes of the city of Poitiers, on the route of Limoges, which is another city in France, and that's the name of the road where the camp was. And it was called the camp of the route of Limoges. And we wanted her to escape, and we had the means for her to escape. And she refused to escape because she was a medical student, and in the camp she was taking care of the children, and she felt that it was too important a job and that she did not want to escape because nobody else was taking care of the children in the camp. So we were able to cross into non-occupied France. You saw that I was in Marseille and I finished my studies. But my sister was, after Poitiers, was transferred to Drancy near Paris, then to Pithiviers, and on September 21st, 1942, she was deported to an unknown destination. In her last letter to a boyfriend, she couldn't write to us because we were already in non-occupied France and there was no communication between the two sections of France. So she wrote to a boyfriend and told him that it's a postscriptum. On the last rumors, we are supposed to go to Metz, which was our hometown, so no need to for work. So no need to dramatize. These are the last words she ever wrote because she was really deported to Auschwitz and she never came back. So I always like to honor my sister before I talk about myself. So after that, you saw in the DVD, I finished my training as a registered nurse in Marseille, and after that I left for Paris, where I lived until the liberation of Paris by the French army, the French First Division commanded by General Leclerc, and the next day by the American army. And after the liberation, I tried to join the army. It was extremely difficult because my identity papers were forged without the stamp Jews. That's why I was able to survive during the occupation. And because all Jews had a stamp Jews on the card. We were two supposed to wear the stamp, but I didn't, the yellow star with the written Jew inside. But I had worn it in Poitiers, but once I left Poitiers, I never wore it again. So that's why I was able to survive, like I told you. And in Paris, I tried to join the army, and I could not give them the right papers because my identity card was forged. So they didn't accept them. On top of it, I didn't have my birth certificate, and my hometown of Metz was not yet liberated. So I couldn't get any birth certificate. So the army wouldn't accept me, and I had to prove that I had not collaborated. How do you prove something you haven't done? So I couldn't prove that. But the mother of my fiancé, you saw in the DVD that he was executed by the Germans on October 6, 1943, on Mont Valérien near Paris. And his mother vouched for me that I was a good person. So the army accepted me finally. So I was accepted in the army. Paris was liberated in August 1944, and I joined the army in November 1944. And I was sent to Alsace, where the front was at the time. When I arrived in Alsace, I was assigned to a regiment, the 151 Regiment of Infantry. And in that regiment, I was a social worker, like you saw in the DVD, because they had enough nurses and they didn't need me as a nurse. And for 3 weeks, I worked as a social worker, and then one day crossing the square of the village at lunchtime, I met the colonel of the regiment who stopped me and asked me to answer his phone in his office during his lunchtime. So you don't refuse. When your colonel asks you something, you don't refuse. So I went with him to the office, and he showed me around, and leaving very courteous, he told me, I am sorry, I have nothing for you to read. There are only German books here. And I answered that I read German fluently. That's quite all right. And then, very interested, he walked back towards me and said, do you speak German? And I told him, yes, I speak German fluently. That's one of the questions you can ask me, why I spoke German. I have no time to explain now. So he told me that the army, the French army, the secret service of the French army was desperately looking for women who spoke German fluently, because men could not go into Germany, because all the men in Germany from the age of 12 to very old men were all mobilized in the army. And any man walking in the streets of Germany would have been immediately suspicious and arrested. That's why they needed women. So I told him I accepted to be transferred to the intelligence service. 2 days later, I was picked up by the intelligence service, taken to Freiburg, to Mühlhausen, which is a city in Alsace, where I underwent an extremely intensive training. That's another question you can ask me, what kind of training I had, if you are interested. And then I was assigned to the Commandos of Africa, which was a regiment of the French First Army. And the Colonel Bouvet was commanding that regiment. And the first assignment that Colonel Bouvet gave me was to interrogate officers, German officers, prisoners of war, about the plan of retreat of the German army from France to Germany. You have to know that all armies in the world have a plan of attack, but they have also a plan of retreat, because you never know how things will turn out. So after that, I interrogated colonels and generals, because subaltern officers would know anything about it, and I got very important information on the plan of retreat of the German army from France to Germany. And that I can boast about it, because it's written in one of the citations of my Croix de Guerre, one of the medals you will see later. But anyway, after that, Colonel Bouvet asked me to go into mission, to cross the front of in Alsace, because the front was still in Alsace. We were still fighting in Alsace, and to cross the front. And 13 times I tried to cross the front, and I was not successful. The reasons were multiple. One was that the intelligence we had was not always accurate. And when I arrived at the place where I was supposed to do something, things were not the way they were described. So I couldn't do it. Another reason was that the military guide gave me wrong information on the ground where I was supposed to walk. And he was human. He didn't do it purposely. He was human. He made mistakes several times. I give you an example. that was the first time I tried to cross the front into the from the French side to the German side. And that was near the city of Thann, and I was taken by an escort of 20 soldiers and 4 officers to a certain point in a valley and left there. And I was supposed to go to cross the valley and go up the mountain, which is called the Amselkopf. You can look it up on Google tonight if you want. And on the Amselkopf, the guide told me to go on the second pathway. And they were pathways which were all parallel. But to go on the second pathway, to wait until it was light, because that was during the night, to wait until it's light and then walk along the pathway about an hour and get to the very important armed post of the German army. So I crossed the valley and sat near at the entrance of the pathway, the southern pathway, and when it started to be a little light, I crossed into towards the German line, and walking, suddenly I knew that I could expect that, but it still was extremely traumatic. A soldier sprung from behind the tree with his rifle and bayonet attached to it and said, "Kill me." So I knew right away that he was a French army. And 3 more soldiers arrived with machine guns, and they wanted to shoot me because they thought I was a German spy. Because I was in civilian clothes. You can understand that when you are a spy, you are not in military uniform. So they wanted to shoot me on the spot. But I had been told how to get out of such a predicament, and I was able to get out of it. I was very assertive, and I told them to call the officer that I was not going to talk to them, that they couldn't shoot me, and I talked French, so they were very impressed. They were all Moroccan soldiers, because we had in our army Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian, and black soldiers. And these soldiers were all 4 of them Moroccan soldiers. But they finally called the officer, and I was taken back to the headquarters, because the German had seen, were all around, and they had seen me arrested. I couldn't go on with my mission. That's how things worked out sometimes. That's one of the examples. So 13 times I was not successful. So the captain of my intelligence service decided that I was going to cross into Germany directly from Switzerland. Now Switzerland was a neutral country, but during the whole war, when the Germans were successful, they were helping the Germans. Now that we were successful, they were helping us. So the Colonel Rainer of the Swiss custom, of the Swiss secret service of the custom in Basel, which is a city in Switzerland, accepted that he will help me cross directly from Switzerland into Germany. So I was taken to his office by one of our officers, and Colonel Rainer called an agent, Mr. Lemaire. All these names are pictures. And Mr. Lemaire took me by car to Schaffhausen. chosen because Schaffhausen has enclave. That means a Swiss territory just into Germany. And I'm going to explain to you how it works. Mr. Lemaire took me by car to a little forest. We stopped the car, we crossed the forest by foot, and on the other side of the forest was a huge field. And on the northern edge of the field was a road. Now, the forest and the field were Switzerland, but the road was belonging to Germany. And the road was supervised, was controlled by two armed military German sentinels. One came from the eastern edge of the field, of the width of the field, walked about half to the middle of the width of the field, stopped. The other sentinel came from the west, met him in the center. They talked 2-3 seconds, then turned their back and walked towards the edge of the field on both sides. And they were doing that constantly without stopping. And Mr. Lemaire told me, towards evening, you are going to crawl along the field and hide behind the bushes near the road. When both soldiers turn their back to you, and when they come back and separate again and turn their back to you again, you walk on the road. There was no fence, nothing to separate the field from the road. You just walk on the road and go towards the east and meet the soldier who comes back. So very nice. We stayed in the forest all afternoon, and Mr. Lemaire was a middle-aged man, married with children. I was 24 years old, and in the afternoon he was talking to me about his wife and children, and towards the afternoon, with a little smile, he said to me, you know, you may die tonight, so why don't we have a good time now? But that was not on my agenda. So after that, towards evening, he told me now is the moment. I had no compass, I had no maps, I had no radio, I had no arm, and everything I needed to know was in my memory. And I had only a small suitcase with clothes to change, that's all. So towards evening, Mr. Lemaire told me now is the moment. So I took my little suitcase and I crawled along the field and hid behind the bushes. Until now, everything was fine. But once behind these bushes, I realized the immensity of what I was going to undertake. I had very little information of what was going on in Germany. That's why I was sent there, to give back to France information, because we did not know how people were reacting to the war at the time. And I knew that I had that I was lacking some important information that I should know, because it was impossible to teach me everything. So I was so terrified that I was absolutely paralyzed by fear. And it took me a very, very long time to overcome that fear and to be able to function. And then I got up and went on the road and walked towards the soldier who came back towards me. I was walking towards the east, towards Singen, Singen, a city in Germany that you can look up on Google too. And the soldier came back towards me, and I raised my arm, Heil Hitler, and then he asked for my identity papers. I was now called Martha Ulrich on my papers. And I was a German nurse, and I was supposed to work in I try to remember. It doesn't matter, I can tell you later if I remember. But in another city that I didn't know anything about. But anyway, he gave me back my papers, so I was reassured. And now I was in Germany. So I will briefly tell you what I achieved in Germany.
Working with the German.
Yeah. As you have seen in the video, in the DVD, I met that SS who fainted. I was a German nurse. I am supposedly a German nurse. I took care of him. When he regained consciousness, he was so grateful for my care that he invited me to come and visit him at the Siegfried Line. That's another question you can ask me, what was the Siegfried Line, if you're interested. And when I arrived, and he gave me his phone numbers. For 3 weeks, I didn't go back. I had other things to do. But when I came back to Freiburg, I heard on the German radio that the Allied armies were very close to Freiburg and were ready to invade Freiburg very shortly. So I thought that's a moment to go back to the Siegfried Line. I walked to the Siegfried Line, and that's where I discovered that the Siegfried Line was completely evacuated. The last stragglers were leaving. So I went back very fast to Freiburg because I understood how important that information was, because that meant that we did not have to fight against the Siegfried Line, which was an extremely important underground fortress manned by a great army and with a lot of up-to-date equipment. So I walked back to Freiburg, and Freiburg was completely empty. All the inhabitants of Freiburg were so terrified at the idea that a foreign army was going to invade them. I lived through that, and I tell you, it's awfully frightening. So they were all locked in their homes. I was all alone in Freiburg. So I went into the main avenue and waited. And the first tank arrived. And the first tank rode towards me. So I went in the middle of the road, and I made the V sign, the victory sign of Winston Churchill, to show that I was a friend. And I was you understand that I was in civilian clothes again. So they could have bumped me, but they stopped just in front of me, because I'm very lucky in life. If not, I wouldn't be here. And then I asked for the officer in charge of the tank to come down and talk to me. He came, and I discovered that that was the French army, which was very lucky for me, because the American may not have trusted me at all. But I was very assertive, and I told that officer that I needed to go immediately to headquarters because I had a very important information to give them. So he accepted, and he took me immediately to headquarters, where I met Commander Petit, to whom I gave the information. He was first very suspicious. He told me it could be a trick. Who told me that it's a trap? Who told me that you are really a French agent? And I gave him a phone number, because in the army you can call everybody, and he got in relation with my service, and that reassured him that he could trust me. And they were happy to know that I was still alive, because they had no news from me for quite a while. So after that, I gave them, I told Colonel Petit that the Siegfried line was completely evacuated. He sent a patrol to check, and they came back and said that's true. The Siegfried line is completely evacuated. So that night, I was a big VIP at the headquarters. I slept, I ate dinner with them, and they gave me a room. And the next morning, I got up. At breakfast, Commander Petit asked me if I wanted to go back to my unit. I told him no, my mission isn't terminated. I want to go back to cross the front again in the south of Freiburg. But I asked him for a bicycle because I was tired of walking. So he gave me a bicycle, and now I left with 2 wheels and riding down from a big summit, because in the south of Germany there are big mountains. I saw, stopped on the side of the road, a group of German military ambulances. So I stopped to inquire what they were doing there, and I was talking to the colonel doctor, he was a doctor who commanded them, and I was complaining that our army was not, our German army was not fighting anymore as much as they should, and that, and he told me, after a while he told me, and now I was even a better German patriot. I had escaped from Freiburg, where the French, I was afraid of the French army, which had, he said for me, they have to leave.
Yeah, please, like 5 minutes.
Okay, but they had to, I was afraid of the French army, which had Moroccans, Algerian, Tunisian, and black soldiers. And you know how much the Germans were racist and what effect it had on him. So after a while he told me, don't be so terrified. Everything will be okay. The war isn't ended. And he told me exactly where the remnant of the German army was hidden in ambush in the Black Forest, waiting for the Allied army. And that information I was able to get by going myself into Switzerland and giving my letter of information to a Swiss custom man who sent it to Colonel Reiner, who sent it to my French army intelligence. That's why I got all these medals.
Sending me here. My name is Rebecca Brady, but my name used to be Rebecca Marcus. It's a Jewish name. I was born 1933 in Amsterdam, Holland. Gee, what's that one? Anyway, in 1939, the newspapers and the radio would say that Poland was invaded by Germany. Who cares? That's so far away. I looked it up in the map. But my father said, no, that doesn't look good. And a lot of people were starting to get worried about it. Did anybody ever read or see the movie The Diary of Anne Frank? Good. And do you believe the Holocaust did happen? Or do you think it did not happen? Well, it did happen. So, started my story. I was a young girl when the war started. And 1940, after they invaded Poland, the Germans came and they bombed Rotterdam. It was a terrible thing. We could even hear it in Amsterdam, and that's like 60 kilometers away, and completely destroyed the beautiful city. Then, of course, the Germans came into Amsterdam and all over Holland. I think the Dutch military tried to fight it. I think it took 2 days and they gave up. So, they said, why worry about the Germans? They look like us. They talk a little different, but they're not like us. Germans are like us. They look the same. No way, because 1941 they already started with the Jews had to wear a star. First you had to sign in how many Jewish grandparents you had. Well, my mother's mother was Jewish, and a child that is born by a Jewish mother is Jewish, even if her father is not Jewish. So my mother was Jewish, but she saw the writing on the wall, and she saw how they were doing in Germany. So when she signed in, she says, no Jewish grandparents, nothing. My father, full Jew. Yeah, of course, proud, I'm a Jew, signed in. So that was just the start of the war. And then the people had to wear a star. My father wore a star. I wear it once in a while. I thought it was great to wear a star. But I'm a Jew, but I'm also Dutch. What's the difference? Well, a lot of difference. But because before you knew it, the Jewish men that would be walking on the street were just picked up right on the street and put away. Those were the first razzias. They were called razzias. Off they went. Never be heard of it. The first were gone. Then they would come to the home, or first they will send you a note, you have to assemble at a corner. And I remember one of my neighbors going there, and she had a tablecloth with all the belongings in there. She was a girl a couple of years older than I, and her mother, and she stood there on the corner. We couldn't go into the street because they had closed it off. And I thought, why are they taking her away? She has never done anything. She's a good girl. Why are they taking her away? Never saw her again. And then the other people, they were alphabetical. They had to go. They can only take with them a little suitcase with a toothbrush or whatever, pajamas or whatever, and they had to go somewhere. And if you don't go with them, they would come to the house, knock on the door, house, and they would go. Fathers and sons would go in one moving van, and mothers and daughters in the other. And I still remember that the sound of, "Dag papa, dag mama, see you later, see you later." Some of them, well, they put them in another place in outside of Amsterdam, Westerbork. They had already, and they would stay there for a while, until maybe some of them stayed there for a couple of weeks. Some of them right away were put in the train, gone to Auschwitz. Well, most of my relatives were gone to Sobibor, the Dutch. They put the Dutch people on the train to Sobibor. But in the meantime, 42 came. I was just going ahead of time. My uncle came and said, "Can you take care of my son Jappie?" Jappie was 1 year younger than I was. So my father said, "Sure, he can come and stay with us." We had just a little apartment, and for a while Jappie even went to school, and he ate with us, he slept with us, we slept together. You know, little kids can sleep like that together. And he was there for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden Uncle Philip came back. "You're not taking care of Jappie. I'm taking him away from you guys." He was one of us. He was my little brother, and he was taken away with my uncle. And I never forget the night that they took Jappie, and I hear still his voice going down the step. "Ik wil bij Tante Maria blijven. Ik wil bij Tante I want to stay with Aunt Maria." And that was the last voice I ever saw or heard of Jappie. So Jaapie went, my nephew went with his aunt, the sister of his wife, Uncle Philip, who was a single woman. And Jaapie stayed there maybe a couple of weeks, and then they found out somebody, collaborator, sold him for a little bit of guilders and took him away, Jaapie and his aunt. Uncle Philip was staying separate with his wife and his in-laws. So Uncle Philip came back to my father, who was still upset that my uncle took Jaapie away, and said, "Can we stay with you? Because I'm worried that Jaapie or Aunt Rose will tell that where we are staying, and then they will come and pick us up." You have to understand, there were always collaborators that for a couple of guilders they would sell you out. There are a lot of good Dutch people too, but they're just not enough. So Uncle Philip stayed with us and on Doris and her parents. Now you have to understand this tiny little apartment in Amsterdam, and my brother, who was 2 years older than I am, I had to sleep on the floor. I slept on the Davenport anyway. And they stayed with us for a couple of months, and they found a better place. That is Uncle Philip and his wife. So we had the old folks staying with us. Well, they had false identity papers, the old people. And once in a while they would go on the street. But most of the time they were afraid to go because, like I said, collaborators. They asked my father, or he told him, "You have to go and work in the park." My father was a tailor, and he had to dig ditches. And my father said, "That's not for me. I can't do that." So after a week or so, he had to go real early in the morning and go to that field and dig ditches and whatever. And one day he said, "I had it," and he took the shovel and he hit himself on the heel and it started festering. And he said, "Come on." He wanted us to kick him, and my brother, "You can't kick your father," and so that he would get real bad looking. And then the German doctor come to the house. "Mr. Marcus and Mr. Oh, you'll be okay next week. You better go back." Well, of course, I'm not going back. So every time they came for the control, my mother, who spoke German, "My husband is gone. I don't know where he is. Maybe he is already picked up. Don't bother us." In the meantime, all the relatives would hide in the closet, this little closet that we had, but they stood there anyway. And of course, those people had no ration cards, and so we had to share our food, what little there was. And so my father, who was a very nervy guy, would trade clothes for food. And then one time we went to, in the evening, my father, I couldn't go swimming, I couldn't go to the park, I couldn't go on the bicycle, I couldn't go on the streetcar. And in those days when the streetcars were still running, later everything was off. Also, we had to close all our blinds with black paper so that no lights would shine through, because the English was flying over and they could see the light. And so it had to be dark. Well, of course, later on we had no light because they turned all our lights and the gas off and all that. We had nothing. And to cook, we had the old-fashioned stove, where you pot-belly stove, where you put stuff in. Of course, we had no coals either, but we burned anything we could put our hand on. So one time my father went to deliver an outfit, and it was in the evening, and he was not to be on the street. As a matter of fact, the Dutch people were not even to be outside after 8 o'clock. But my father says, "It's dark, I'm going to go anyhow to deliver that, and I get some food." So we walked to this place. It was a store. I remember they sold hats. We walked in, and there were 2 German officers. Oh my gosh, what now? And the lady said, "Mr. Marcus, you must be afraid now." And my father said, "They only can bring them, me and my daughter, where my brothers and sisters are." And the German said, "Well, we are good Germans. If you're worried about walking home, I will walk you home." And I said, no, that's okay. And I remember walking in the dark. We would go one corner. Oh, okay, go in. Until we got home, so safe. But it was a very hard time. There were some good people across the street. They were Protestant people, and they would come over and they would give sometimes some ration cards for the other people, for my opa and oma. They were not my relatives, but we called them that. And they would deliver illegal newspapers. And then I would put those under my, of course they were like 2 pieces of paper, and I put them under my sweater, and then I would deliver. Of course, if they would catch me, I would have been shot dead right then and there, because you're not to have that kind of stuff. But I was always a real nervy person, and I did that. And but there were also some funny times that we had. I mean, with the relatives, they would talk about the old time, and we would laugh. But mostly it was always a very nervy time, because we never know when they would knock on the door, because everybody was gone, and all the neighbors were gone. And then they would, after they would leave, after they picked up, they would go in the house, and then they would take out all the furniture. Can you imagine you live somewhere and your parents have worked real hard to get a nice place with everything, beds and couches and chairs. They all picked them up, and they all goes in a big moving van, and then they would say, gifts from the Dutch people. That were not gifts, they were stolen from the Dutch people. And nobody came back. None of my relatives came back. My father said, he counted one time, he said there must have been about 100 of my relatives, uncles, nephews, assorted in there. He said they never came back. So if people said the Holocaust didn't happen, it did happen. And when I look at you people and I see all those different nationalities, some of you people were born here, some of them came with your parents. And look at you guys, you all get along pretty well together. It's the most beautiful place in the world. So you should be happy here. And then don't let it ever happen again.
My name is Rosalie Wattenberg. I was born and raised in Warsaw, Poland, 1939, September 1st. We heard some shots, and the Germans started to come in. We would not believe what happened. And the Polish people were looking up in the sky, saw planes, and they used to say, these are ours. But they were not. They were the German planes bombing Warsaw. I'll make it short. I survived. I survived the bombing. I survived 5 years of concentration camps, going from one camp to another, walking for 3 days, walking every day. At night we had to stop because they were afraid that we're gonna escape. But we did not escape because, first of all, my sister and I used to push her up at the cave, not to go in because the rain was filling up the cave. That's all I can tell you. And I'm gonna make it sweet and sharp. I am a survivor of the Holocaust.
Are there any questions you guys want to know? We got liberated by the Canadians, but right after that the Americans came, and that was the most wonderful thing, because after that we got food, and well, they dropped all those packages down, and it was just unbelievable food that we never seen before. Of course, you had to be very careful eating that because we were so starved. And when we saw people that did survive the camp, none of my relatives, but we have seen them coming back, and they were like skeletons. It was horrible. And you had to be very careful when, after the war, when you got food, that you don't overeat, because you had nothing. And then so you, anything you can put your hands on, you put in your mouth, but took care of that. So, until I came to America in '55, and very brave, age of 21 with $50 in my pocket, and here I am. I still don't have the $50, but I got credit cards. So anyway, guys, enjoy your life here, because this is the best you can do.
If you don't mind me asking, when people think of the concentration camps...
Yes, speak up.
Oh, sorry. If you don't mind me asking, when people think of the concentration camps of the Holocaust, they usually think of Auschwitz. That's sort of the go-to thought of how the concentration camps were. Were all of them like that, or at least the
No,
ones that
there
you
were
went to?
different concentration camps. There were
I was in
Sobibor.
Majdanek.
Yeah, there were so many different. Even in Germany, they had concentration camps even before the war for political reasons. They had concentration camps. But then I have one relative that went to Theresienstadt, and I think that's Czechoslovakia. I'm not sure. But most of them, the Dutch people mostly went to Sobibor. But what camp did you? You went to different camps, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in Majdanek, but before Majdanek I was in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Yeah.
And from the ghetto we escaped and tried to make a life of our own. But then we stopped. They called us, and we were walking for 4 days. Nights, we were resting near some caves, so they wouldn't let us escape. And when we arrived in Dachau, Germany, it was very quiet, and all of a sudden, all the prisoners, including me, were yelling, "We are free! The Americans are at the gates." My sister never believed. I said to her, "Helen, come on out and see for yourself. We are free, no more." And at one time, we were supplied with soups. The soups were so thick that you could stand a spoon in it. Somebody, I was very little, I'm not big now, but I was smaller then because dehydrated and skinny. Somebody picked me up and threw me into the kettle of soup. And I came to my sister. They were spooning the soup off of me. And I took off my clothes, and they gave me something to wear. That's all I can tell you. I can tell much more, but too short of a time.
Actually, we're going to ask you to,
I'm Rosalie Wattenberg, survivor of the Second World War. I was born and raised in Warsaw, Poland, with a very comfortable family, not rich, but comfortable. We always had what we needed and what we wanted.
The microphone's on. We'll get it out.
Okay. So, now you can hear, oh, I get a feedback. Now you can hear me. I was born and raised in Warsaw, Poland. I come from a comfortable family, and we were always whatever we needed, we had. That was it. My father was a leather merchant. My mother was a housekeeper. She stayed home, never worked a day except home, and raised 5 children. My oldest brother, during the war, he was a doctor. He escaped to Russia because the Germans were looking for intelligentsia. And they came to look for him. And my father said, do I look like a doctor? I'm not a doctor, because they both had S. Frommer. My father's name was Shlomo. My brother's name was Shimon. So they thought that it's my brother. After that, during the war, they were coming for men, especially for men into the ghetto, to take some Jewish men to labor camps. When they started that, the janitor from the building let them knock on the gate so we could hear, and I was the one who brought my brother, my father, and my first husband up to the attic to lock them up. And in the dark, I walked down the stairs back to the apartment. We survived all that. But then we also survived. When we started to go to camp, they made us walk. I'm trying to get my memory back. It's not easy for what we went through. From the ghetto, we went to a working camp. My first husband and I and my sister. Mom remained back because my father was already gone. They took him out of bed, and I never saw my father again. So we remained, my first husband, my sister, and I. My youngest brother was out of the ghetto and into the Christian side of Warsaw. But unfortunately, some people pointed them out that he is hiding Jews, and they were all killed. 5 people, 3 grown-ups and 2 children were killed at that time. Then they took us to a camp. The first camp was Majdanek. It was the famous death camp. My sister and I, we survived. I kept on telling her, we have to fight. And I was the fighter, not physically, but mentally. trying to get back my memory. After that, we went to several camps, and we remained in Majdanek. You heard of Majdanek. It was like Auschwitz. It was the same thing, but I survived Majdanek. My sister, both of us. She was very negative, but I kept her up spiritually and mentally. Unfortunately, she's gone now.
Rosalie, how long were you in Majdanek?
About 6 months. Starved. The portion of bread was enough for a bird. And soup was watery soup, that's all. And everybody was trying to get to the bottom of the kettle. Otherwise, all they did get is water, just flavored water. Any questions? I can bring my...
When the Allies were advancing on Majdanek, this is when they began to move you, and you participated in what is known as the death marches, right? When the Allies were advancing to Majdanek, they started to move you and march you.
Yeah.
Deeper into Germany.
Yeah.
That became known as the Death March. There were a lot of people that died during that period, right? And I remember you telling us that.
But I am a survivor of Majdanek. From Majdanek, they took us south because the Russians were approaching Warsaw, and they shipped us south, and I was liberated by the American troops in, I can't remember,
1945.
in one of the German, southern German camps.
Dachau. Right, Dachau. It's the only southern camp I know of. Anyhow, Dachau, I would say. So did you have any questions? If not, we'll shift gears.
Anyone have any questions for Rosalie? You do. Okay.
When,
You have to speak up.
were you excited about the Russian advance, or was it a negative thing? Being from Poland, I know you guys have tensions with Russia, but with them being an Allied advance, were you excited?
Well, I also was liberated in Poland, and I was delighted with the Russians there. Again, you know, the mentality is, did you have a choice? It certainly was a heck of a lot better than being persecuted and aimed at all the time by the Germans. The Russians did not do that. In fact,
Whether
they
it was
treated
the
us
Poles or
like
the
gentlemen
Germans.
and ladies.
Any more questions?
Okay.
Can you stand still?
So what I would like to do before I get started is tell you a few things. But before I do, I would like to load a DVD, which is about half an hour long. And it tells you very succinctly about my and my family's survival, which is entirely different than camp survivals. We were in hiding. Or maybe you can put it back. also want to, if you don't mind, I don't feel comfortable. I also want to tell you that in a more global way, that's what I know, because I was involved in the interviews. In fact, I directed about 100 of them, including Miss Rosalie's and her sister together, because they were never separated. So I know I have a lot of background, my own personal experience, and secondhand experience what I heard from other people.
Could you
So
please
if
use
you
the
have,
mic?
can I
I'm
use the
sorry.
mic? I can use the mic. Okay. So do I need to repeat?
Please.
Okay. So let me first start out and tell you that for about 30 or 35 years after liberation, I had nothing to do with Holocaust. My daughter, like maybe most of you, had an essay to do for high school on the Holocaust, and she came to me to interview me. He said, go talk to Grandpa, my father. And so what brought me out is the deniers. They came and
Battery is dead.
sabotage.
Well, it went to sleep.
Yeah, I think I can be louder. So
See,
the
my
deniers,
voice
the
carries.
deniers came on the scene and said, the Holocaust never happened. And I
Oh.
looked at myself and said, what the heck are they talking about? Where was I? And I should also tell you that from my point of view, what I've observed and know from other people, the Holocaust never ends. The killing stopped. The Holocaust hasn't. We still have memories, the way we react through things is through Holocaust lenses. You know, we all reflect on things through our background. And for me and many others, the Holocaust background is the strongest. Not only were Jews persecuted and killed during the Holocaust, because about 11 million died. Just about half were Jews. So anybody who was non-Aryan, you know what I mean by Aryan? Blonde, blue-eyed, had no right to live under the Nazi Germany rules. I saw a table which listed the Aryans on the very top. They need a lot of living space, therefore they have to conquer a great deal of Europe. And not only do they need to conquer, but they also need to get rid of a lot of people. Primarily Jews, gypsies, and intellectuals, people who were disabled, all kinds of those things. And then were peoples like, for instance, Poles. We need to enslave them. And so the Germans had a program to go through and systematically do what they were planning to do. And I insist they systematically subdued us and trained us to be resigning, to not care whether we lived or died. And they succeeded with many or most, I would say 90% of the Jews, if not more. In my own case, which I will tell you in a minute if you turn on the video, we survived because I lived in a small village. We never had the German army stationed there, nor did we have Russian army stationed there at the end. And the Germans had what they call Sonderkommandos, or special troops, which were going around from place to place and liquidating people. 500 men out of Hamburg, Germany, a special detachment of retired policemen, were brought in specially to wipe out the Jews of Poland. And I remember reading the story when they came and the first assignment was given them to wipe out a fairly large community. And the commandant, the leader of the group, actually cried. And he told the people, you don't have to participate if you don't want to. It's not mandatory. And about 5 didn't. But a great deal of them did. So I want you to know that not everybody had to kill. I also make it my business to try to preclude genocide. So I study a lot about what happened and where it happened and how do you get rid of it. And training and propaganda is what made people want to kill. It was not hate, it was training and propaganda. So I was part of a family of 4, my parents, my sister, and I. And on about August 11th, 1942, the Gestapo, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, it's basically special police, German police who occupied us, came to the village, went to the police station, because normally they came to the Jewish community and did their mischief. But this particular day they went to the police station, and in a very, very short time they turned around, left. And we were just going crazy. It's not the usual behavior, what's going on? Well, the Polish policeman came and told us what was going to happen. So, unless you have questions at this point, in about 2 minutes, turn on the video, and it's about half an hour, so that, and then we can talk about it. Okay, the other thing I want to tell you, that nobody has survived, including concentration camps, without somebody helping them. In my own case, there were about 3 families and about 7 people, 6 or 7 people, who were involved in my rescue. I don't know if you'll walk around this way. In order to survive, you had to first of all have an extreme will to live. Without that, everything else was lost. You had to resist just the right amount. If you resisted too much, you were shot on the spot or killed on the spot. If you didn't resist enough, then events took place that you just perished. In my own family, my mom was the provider of the will to live. She pushed the family to live. My dad was the guy who offered the engineering, the amount of resistance. If you had the right amount of resistance and the will to live, you still needed somebody to help you.
This is the Laguna Beach home of Jack and Leah Parser. As he's done many times in the last 10 years, Jack, a retired U.S. engineer, is on his way to speak before a college class in Orange, California about his family's survival of the Holocaust over 50 years ago.
In Jewish tradition, especially in Poland at the time when this was taking place, it was an asset for a family to have a son to say prayers after they die. And my dad was ready to let his son go, so the rest of the family would live. Quite a hero.
In 1999, Jack, Leah, and Jack's sister, Rose, took a much longer journey, returning to the family home in Yalowa, Poland, to see the families who helped them survive the most dangerous event in their lives. Waiting to greet them at the vacant lot where the Pariser family home had stood were Marissa Schwartzchick and Marissa's niece. At the time of their greatest peril, Marissa was the 10-year-old daughter of Leo Schwartzchick, who had been one of the Parisers' greatest benefactors. Little remains of their home, which was burned by the retreating Germans near the end of World War II. Jack and Rose were only able to find the foundation in the doorway. Abraham, his wife Sarah, and their children Rose and Jacob had crossed this threshold for the last time in 1942, beginning a journey that few European Jews were able to survive. Over the years, the Parisers had remained in touch with the Schwartzchick and Poremski families, and Jack had arranged for their Polish friends to receive the Righteous Christian Award from the State of Israel. The Pariser story really begins on the first day of the war, September 1939. With the German invasion of Poland. Within days, the Germans announced the anti-Semitic laws for Polish Jews. Jews could not go to school. Jews could not own businesses. Jews could not congregate.
We were not allowed to travel. We were not allowed to read newspapers. We were not allowed to do any of that stuff. They also needed us demoralized. So laws or rules were posted that generally were just plastered on the walls, to know that Jews must not be on the same side of the street as a German. You always said sir to a German if he spoke to you. You never spoke to him first. And constantly they were taking things away from us because it was necessary to get us more poor than we were.
These German edicts that made Jews less than second-class citizens were soon followed by actions designed to intimidate and terrorize them.
One late fall, and it had to be 1939, they came in and asked all the Jews, males, to get out into the square, and the younger males all ran or hid. So these guys wound up with a bunch of old people. They got these old guys to go to the synagogue, to take out the Torah scroll. Now these guys were told to put the Torah scroll on the ground. It took quite a bit of beating until they did that. Both my grandparents were in that action. When they got the Torah scroll on the ground, they told them all to walk on the Torah scroll. And that took some more beating. And my paternal grandfather was beaten unconscious. So they had some other Jews drag him to the pond, which was nearby. They broke the ice with him, revived him, brought him back to the scene, got some more beating. I think he was the last one. The Nazis packed up and drove away. And he lived for a while. I don't know, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And then he died. My dad came home. He knelt by my grandfather, kissed him, and the next day we buried him.
Life in Yadlowa went on like this until August 1942, when the Germans altered their habits.
An unusual thing happened. Instead of the SS coming in the VWs in the morning, they came in at sunset, drove through, went to the Polish police, were there maybe 5 minutes, turned around, and left. We were just very baffled. What's going on? It was within minutes that they left. The Polish policeman came and told my mom that the next day the Jews of Yadlowa are going to be liquidated.
As promised, a German death squad returned early the next morning and rounded up the Jews of Yadlowa, an action they repeated relentlessly throughout occupied Europe until the end of the war.
The story has from the villagers that they marched all the able-bodied people to a forest nearby, and a grave was dug, and then all the Jews were stripped naked, marched to the grave 6 at a time, and they were shot into the mass grave until all 160 died.
But the Pariser family was not among them. Abe and Sarah had quickly come to the conclusion that they wanted their family to live, and that they would do whatever it took to come through this nightmare. They could have never imagined what lay before them.
So we gathered basically whatever food we had, and that was loaves of bread because we did our own baking, and whatever clothing we could put on, and we got ready to go. I would like to tell you the gloom that existed at the time of the torture. I was so sad. The animals were sad. The cows kept on moving. The dog howled. The cat was on the foot. It was just a miserable time. And my mom says, I have to go back and sweep up the kitchen. And for a long time, I thought of her crazy. Why would you bother about sweeping up the kitchen when you know that you're leaving your home? I got to thinking that she really didn't go to sweep up the kitchen at all. She wasn't there long enough. She just wanted to take a last look at the kingdom. We went for the woods, and the next day was really a beautiful day, except for the gunfire that we heard. And I always ask myself, why did those people not run away? And I really don't have the exact answer, but my speculation is that people had encumbrances. For example, had my grandfather not died, and the other one as well, in the interim, we would have been left with the decision, do we go away to the woods in bad cold winters with 60, 70-year-olds, or do we stay facing music?
This monument marks the site where 160 of the 300 Jews of Yedloa were shot and buried in a mass grave on August 12, 1942. How many buried here had children too young to flee into the woods, or too elderly, or too frail, or perhaps they just couldn't believe that such a thing was possible? Unlike most of Hitler's victims, the location of Yedloa's Jews is well known, so family members and friends, if there are any left, can visit. The date of their deaths is clearly marked, permitting the saying of Kaddish, a special prayer for the dead on the anniversary of their deaths.
Yizkor Elohim Shemat al kol hazeh shenoflim po, ve'ad kol shenoflim b'shoah, ve'ad kol the righteous between the nations. Shvat Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov, Sarah Rachel B'lev.
The next month in hiding was fairly pleasant, with mild fall days. The family even had some contact with others hiding out in the woods around Yedloa.
And we in the woods probably a month, maybe not even that long. It still is warm and pleasant. And my dad lowered his guard, and we're now sitting in the clear. Normally he knew how to hide. He knew bushes, and he was pretty foxy. So we're sitting in the clear, and a Pole comes with a machete, and he's hunting Jews, and he sees us, and he's going to take us in. So we have a conversation in Yiddish, which we hoped he wouldn't understand. And we just, what are we going to do with him? If we kill him, then that's going to be the end of us anyhow. So luckily my mom says, I know his mother, and let me see if I can negotiate us out. So she told him, take whatever you want, but let us go. And we are in the woods, never again to be in the clear. And now it's really cold, and it's really wet.
The family was now at a point of desperation, and Abe realized that they wouldn't make it without help. So he went to the farmhouse of his former employee, Andrei Poremsky, and asked to be taken in. Andrei, at great risk of death to his entire family, told them to hide in the barn.
And now I need to describe to you life in hiding. We eat one slice of bread, and we never went out, except to go get food or empty the proverbial pot. The proverbial pot was a chamber pot, basically, where all bodily functions were done, in front of everybody. And once a night, one of us had that job, except for my mom. This particular night, it's my dad's turn, and as my dad is doing this, he sees the mother-in-law of the guy who is hiding us coming towards the house, and he is convinced that she saw him, and he doesn't want to trust us, so he goes and arranges for another place to stay.
More good fortune, it would seem, for Abe found another family willing to take them in.
After a very hard and long walk, we arrived at dawn to this place. It was in the outskirts, in the wooded area in Zhurava. We were told to hide in the barn, which we did. We were in the barn all day long. That evening, the woman came up and asked us to come down for supper. The woman asked us to sit on the bench in front of the fire so that we could keep warm until supper was ready. The dog started barking. The door swung open. In came 4 policemen with the guns pointing at us. We obviously have been betrayed. They take us all, handcuff us, and put us on a sled, and they take us to the jail. At the jail, they searched everybody, strip search, and no sooner do they lock the door, my mom goes after my dad, whose name is Abe, and says, Abe, you gotta get us out of here. And my dad goes around the jail and looks at the hinges, looks at the window, looks at all the things, and he comes back and says, people have tried. There's evidence of people having tried every place. No way to get out. So she comes back and says, I remember reading in a newspaper in the United States, thieves got out from the 15th floor. You on the ground floor, what's your problem?
After Sarah's admonishment, Abe took a closer look and realized that the barred windows might offer a way out.
The window has thick bars, even though it has no glass, and the wall is literally this thick, but the frame is only this thick. So my dad gets the idea that the space between the frame and the edge of the wall is all exposed. I should also tell you that before they put us in jail, they gave us a loaf of bread and a knife to cut with. And there was this big discussion between the policemen, very humorous, to be given the penknife or the table knife, which is going to be the least useful for them to break out with. And they gave us the penknife. So using that penknife, we get rid of the mortar and succeed in loosening up and getting rid of those bricks really quickly. And we have the hole just about totally done, except for the brick from the right side. It is very strongly cemented, it sticks out, it is blocking our exit, and now we're in a panic. My dad says, I got to see what time is it, but they took away his watch, so he uncovers the window a little bit and looks out and says, my God, the lights are on at the village. It must be dawning. They're feeding the cattle. You got to get out real quick. It's all for nothing. So he gets this bright idea that he's going to get a piece of wood that is a cross brace on this cut, and he whittles it down, and he's going to wedge the brick, and hopefully it's going to snap, and bang. We now have a hole.
After a short family meeting, the plan was decided. Abe would be lowered first, followed by Sarah, and then Rose. Jacob would help each up to the hole and would be the last out, using a cot as a makeshift ladder.
And he says to me, you know, you may not make it. And he discusses with the family, is it better that we all stay, or are 3 better than none? And because the subject was most unpleasant for all of us, and for me especially, and we were under time pressure, it was just bang, bang. 3 are better than none, get out of here.
On the second try, Jacob was able to pull himself through the hole and join his family on the snow-covered ground below.
We then leave the jail, and we get into the woods. It was daylight. My dad says we have to hide someplace obvious because there probably would be a posse. So he put us in a clump of bushes near a logging camp, and we set the day. As was customary, my dad is going to slice the bread to give everybody a slice of bread. By the way, I didn't tell you that every time there was this ceremony, my mom says, give the children some more. The children says, no, everybody gets the same amount. So he puts the knife to the loaf of bread, which by this time is frozen, and the pin that holds the blade. So the penknife lasted just long enough to get us out of there.
It was clear now that the family had to return to the Poremskys, regardless of the risk. But this time, they dug a hole under the wood shed, put timber over the hole, and covered it with dirt.
The size of that hole was, we were 4 skinny people at that point, and there was not enough room to lie on the back, stomach, or randomly right or left. And most of the time, we stayed in a prone position, lying down. So when your side began to ache, you negotiated with everybody to turn. At the Hole, there was no activity. The people we were staying with were illiterate. You couldn't ask them for paper. You couldn't ask them for a book. You couldn't ask him for any of that stuff, because if you did, and he went out to get it, immediately, why is he getting this? He must have Jews. At every point that you did something, you had to be extremely careful not to provoke any suspicion. We went back to the same style of living, go out for food approximately every 2 weeks. Do not ever leave the building, and preferably not the Hole, unless it was absolutely necessary. When we were out from the building, immediately we just crossed the road and we were in the woods. We climbed a steep hill and then got onto the road to went by the mass grave. And that always was a traumatic event. We kids thought that the dead people are going to catch us. My dad said, be afraid of the living, not the dead. But every time we went for food, we had to go by that grave. We never walked the roads. We always walked off-road. And I do not know if you know farming, but farmers turn the soil over for the winter. And so everything is bumpy. It's not smooth. And under the snow, you just went up and down, up and down, up and down. And when you came back from the trip and you slept, you were still going up and down, up and down. And in that way, we stayed for about 2 years in that hole.
The Parisers stayed in this prison cell of their own design, enduring boredom, frustration, and the endless fear that at any time the hole might become their grave.
Finally, in June of 1944, the Russian army advanced to what's called the Warsaw Line. And that included the river, which was about a quarter of a mile from us, the Wisłoka River. And we are sitting there, seeing the German observer on our side, German army all around us, around New Year's or Christmas time, 1944. I remember it very vividly. Mr. Poremsky comes down, moves away the storage bin. He lies down, his head looks down on us from through the hole, and he says, my wife Adela doesn't want to keep you anymore. You gotta leave. Now, you don't argue about things like that.
Now the family had run out of options, so they struggled across the snow to the farm of Leon Schwarzchek, an old World War I Army buddy of Abe's. The Catholic cemetery in Yedlova is the most likely resting place for many righteous Christians, including those who helped the Parisers. They include the policemen who warned them about the death squads that were coming, the families who gave them food at great personal risk, and most importantly, the Poremsky and Schwarzchek families.
The mere fact that we're here today is due in a large measure to Leon Schwarzchek and his children. However, Leon, in my opinion, deserves statehood. From very early on in the war, Leon saved merchandise for us so that we could later trade it for food while we were in hiding. Never ever did Leon and his children fail to give us food. And it was really tough at the very last few weeks of the war. We had no place to go. Our long-term hiding place was no longer available to us. We came to Lyon with German soldiers all around in tight neighborhoods with neighbors to the right, left, and front and rear, and asked Leo to take us in, and he says, go hide yourself in the barn. No sooner did we do that, the Germans came into the barn and requisitioned it for the horses. We were devastated. Leo comes in when the Germans left, has a talk with my dad. My dad comes back and he says, Leo says, no matter what happens, you stay. And the last 2 or 3 weeks that we were still in hiding was the best 2 or 3 weeks of our life in hiding. For the first time in over 2 years, we had a warm meal every day. And Alicia hid the food under the pig's food brought the food, took back the dirty dishes every day, and did it again day in, day out, with German soldiers all around it. Finally, on the 16th of January, early in the morning, there was a little cannon fire in the distance, and Leo comes up and says, "You are free to go. The Germans are gone, the Russians are here." And that was the extent of our liberation. I can tell you that the amount of excitement among us was like zero. I do not know the reasons for that. I'll give you my theories. One, in order to survive, I think we had to cut feeling. You couldn't be high on feelings and go through all the things that was necessary to go through. Second, the prospect of coming out into liberation was not that rosy. At that point, we were just down to nothing as far as assets are concerned. The only assets we had left over was a coffee can of silver coins that my father buried on the hinges in the cellar. And that was it. So anyhow, before we decided to go out of hiding, my dad says to me, "Not so fast. You go and you see if it is quiet, if really there are no more Germans, if the Russians are here, are the Poles getting drunk and being rowdy, is it safe to come out? And while you are there, make sure you dig out the coins from the cellar, because that's all we have." I go into the cellar and I'm digging out the coins. I now have the can of coins in my hand, and in comes a guy that used to beat me up at school because he was the bully and I was the Jew. And he says to me, "I want to share that." And I said to him, "Not in your lifetime." Now I got to describe to you what I looked like in those days. I was a scrawny kid. My pants had no fabric from here to below the knee, just in the back. I was snow white, and I walked like a duck. But he didn't see that because I was dealing in the cellar. But for whatever reason, he took me seriously, and he turned around and he left.
The Pariser family, against all odds, had survived the Holocaust, which took the lives of at least 6 million European Jews.
Some of us did survive. If the world were more sympathetic and wanted to save more people in desperate straits, Jews and others, lots more would have survived. As it was, the world didn't care, including the United States. We did not care. And we still often don't care. And I would say to us all in here, it's our job to make the government care.
Before leaving Yedloa, probably for the last time, Jack and Rose retraced the route that they took when the family decided to fight for their survival. Down the path, over the bridge, and into the woods started them on a journey which ultimately had a happy ending. But this had been no fairy tale.
We will never be able to repay the debt we owe our rescuers who risked their families' lives to help us, especially the Schwurzer and the Perenskis. Yet when I think back on those days, my most important rescuers were my mother with a strong will to live and my father who made it happen.
Soon after the war's end, the Pariser family made their way into an American displaced persons camp in Germany, where they stayed for 3 years. During this time, Jack completed high school. Rose met and married Abe Chotsky, another survivor, and their daughter Helen was born. The family found Sarah's American brother, who became their sponsor, allowing them to immigrate to the United States. The two families settled in New Jersey, where Rose still resides. Her daughter is a stockbroker in East Brunswick, New Jersey. Jack married Leah Friedman while attending the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And after graduation, the young couple moved to Los Angeles, where Jack took a job at Hughes Aircraft in 1955. In 1972, Abe and Sarah joined them and lived in Orange County for the rest of their lives. Jack and Leah had 3 children, Linda, Eric, and Sandra. Linda, the Anglophile, lives in Manchester. Eric tragically died of AIDS in 1994. Sandra lives with her husband Scott King and their 2 children, Samantha and Evan, in San Diego. Abe and Sarah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1977. They passed away within 4 months of each other in 1989 and are buried in Harbor Lawn Cemetery. On their monument is written, "Holocaust survivors, saved by righteous Christians."
How much time do I have?
Foothill High School in hosting this. How many people have had an opportunity to go to the exhibit at the library, the Courage to Remember exhibit? You raise your hands. How many people are intending upon going to the exhibit at Tustin Library? Would you please raise your hands? I really urge all of you to attend that exhibit. My name is Dr. Alan Bernstein. My name is Dr. Alan Bernstein, and I sit on the City Council here in the City of Tustin, and I played a small part in facilitating this experience. Before Ms. Charlotte Cohen addresses you, I just wanted to say that now all have a responsibility. First of all, to attend that exhibit, which will be there until Sunday. For those of you who have not had intention of going to that exhibit, you should in fact go to that exhibit. Because how many people have read anything by Elie Wiesel? What grade class is this? Sophomore. So no one has written, they haven't written any of the Elie Wiesel pieces as it?
We're currently reading Night.
Currently reading Night. Well, Elie Wiesel, who's a famous author and Holocaust survivor, has written that we must now become the witnesses for the witnesses. By the time most of you are in college or end your college careers, there will be very few Holocaust survivors left. Most of them are in their 80s. Many of them are in their 90s. Charlotte happens to be a youngster at 79, I believe, correct?
76.
That's what I said, 76, excuse me, pardon me. That's what happens when you talk about a lady's age, be careful. And so what I'm hoping that you take away from this is that, A, it increases your knowledge base with regard to something that even to this day there are people that deny ever happened. And B, it motivates you to actually be an activist about it. Because again, you have to be the witness now for the witnesses, and that's why it's so very important to take the time of your busy day and go to that exhibit and appreciate what happened. And without further ado, I bring you Ms. Charlotte Cohen.
Do I hold this? Okay, good. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to come here to speak with you today. It's a privilege for me to be here and to talk about one of the darkest periods in my life and for the world. It's unfortunate that someone would have to talk about the atrocities that occurred during the Holocaust, but I feel it's very important to talk about the war to anyone who will listen, but most especially to young people, in the hope that what happened to me and to my family and the 12,000 people who were murdered during World War II will never ever happen again. You may have noticed that I mentioned 12 million people died during the Holocaust. Most people refer to the 6 million Jews who died, and while the focus of Hitler's wrath was on the Jews, anyone and everyone who did not agree with his views was eliminated. Those included gypsies, homosexuals, and even German non-Jews. Jews who did not want to follow Hitler's rules.
Let me begin by telling you about myself. I was born in Antwerp, Belgium, in July of 1938, and Hitler was already in power in Germany, and anti-Semitism was becoming more and more apparent. When World War II broke out in 1940, I was 20 months old, living with my parents, maternal grandparents, and other family members on my mother's side in Belgium. My father's family lived in Rotterdam, Holland. In May of 1940, all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 35 were summoned to report to the police station in Antwerp to travel to England, where they enlisted in the Royal Dutch Army. My father was one of them, and it would take 5 long years before I saw him again. My maternal grandparents left Belgium for Holland because they thought it would be safer for them there since they were Dutch citizens. I stayed in Belgium with my mother, and we moved in with my aunt, who lived in an apartment on top of a grocery store in Antwerp. The owner, who we found out after the war was a member of the Belgian Nazi Party, told the Nazis where we were, so we were forced to flee from Belgium. With my aunt's help, my mother got in touch with professional smugglers whom we had to pay a large amount of money and give personal belongings like my mother's wedding ring to purchase a bike and get a map of a route the smugglers used. With me in the back, my mother rode a bicycle from Belgium into Holland during the middle of the night. All the while we were being pursued by agents of the Gestapo, the Dutch Nazis, and I was quite scared. All along the route, signs stated that anyone caught would be shot. When we arrived in Amsterdam, we moved in with my maternal grandparents. During that time, my mother worked as a housekeeper at her aunt's house. Her aunt was married to Joseph Asher, whose family owned a large diamond factory in Amsterdam. Because of Asher's status, my mother was first classified by the Nazis under a so-called privileged class, and was therefore, at least for the time being, placed on an exempt list and was not deported to a concentration camp, even though at that time deportations were in full swing. We were unable to walk outside freely and had to be very careful when we did so that we were not picked up by the Nazis and taken away. When the landlord found out that we were Jews, we had to move again. This time, our living quarters was a very small apartment above a pickle shop. Whenever the streets were free of Gestapo agents, my grandfather and I would sneak downstairs to eat pickles. That was also the last time I would celebrate a birthday before being taken away to a concentration camp. For my 5th birthday, my grandfather had decorated a chair with paper, and my family sang to me. My paternal grandfather had a job as an undertaker for the Jewish community in Rotterdam, Holland. I saw him just once during the war when he pretended to have had a funeral to attend in Amsterdam so that he could see me for the last time, and so that he was permitted to travel, something that the Nazis no longer permitted. I remember seeing my father's father at a train station coming towards me and wearing a black coat and a top hat. We were able to talk to him only briefly, and he had to return to Rotterdam. It was the last time I saw him, and my memories of him, as well as his wife, my father's mother, are vague. In the beginning of 1943, we were ordered by the Dutch Nazis to move to the Judenviertel, the Jewish quarters, where we were forced to stay inside at all times under house arrest. On September 29, 1943, after being arrested during one of the many nightly roundups by the Gestapo, my mother, my grandparents and myself, as well as other family members, were taken to Westerbork, a transit camp in the northern part of Holland. Westerbork had originally been established by Dutch authorities for Jewish refugees who had fled Germany. Westerbork and Vught, an under Dutch camp, had been turned into a transitional camp, serving as assembly points for masses of Jews in paralyzing raids. From those camps, thousands of Jews were transferred to various concentration camps. Within the camp, the SS, which stood for Schutzstaffel, meaning an elite guard, set up a Jewish camp leader who kept order among the Jewish prisoners and who were used as extra security so that nobody could escape. While in Westerbork, I was allowed to visit my grandmother who worked in the laundry room and my grandfather who was in the hospital ward suffering from stomach cancer. The last time I saw my grandfather was a day after he had surgery. I visited him in his hospital room, and I remember being very scared because he had a spot of blood on his pajamas. My mother picked me up so I could give him some licorice I still had with me, and I could kiss him goodbye. My mother worked with her mother in the laundry room in Westerbork, as she eventually saw my father's brother and sister-in-law there. It was at Westerbork that her sister-in-law gave birth to a baby boy. One day, my mother and I were sent to another concentration camp, leaving behind my grandmother. My mother had tried to take her mother with us to the next concentration camp, but it was to no avail. Our last moments together were spent crying on the train platform. My grandmother's last words to my mother were, "In case I don't survive, don't cry and go on living." The deportation train took my mother and me to Bergen-Belsen in Germany. When the operation was over, hundreds of thousands of Jews had been deported from Holland at the end of the war. Barely any had survived. While Bergen-Belsen started out as a so-called model camp, known to be somewhat better than the others, it became worse there for the prisoners as the day passed. In 1944, the commanding officer, SS Captain Joseph Kramer, better known as the Beast of Belsen, began accepting inmates from other camps who were too frail to continue their slave labor. The population of Bergen-Belsen swelled by the thousands as new prisoners, most of them starved and diseased after weeks of forced marches, were sent there. Like in many other camps, the Germans held lengthy roll calls at all hours of day or night, forcing us to stand in freezing temperatures and hot weather for sometimes hours at a time without shoes, clad in rags and often very sick. Some prisoners, though near death, still found the will to stand upright, as of to struggle for life itself for one's own sake or for that of a friend of relative. They would not show their despair to the Nazis. The prisoners tried to hang on to whatever inner strength they had in order to survive. Parents, like my mother, put on a brave front to keep strong for their children. the determination to retain some shred of human dignity, the daily struggle just to stay alive in spite of hunger, filth, diseases, and the physical brutalities calculated to reduce us to animals, is one of the most awful memories about my experience. Thousands of prisoners were brought from other camps to Bergen-Belsen, one on foot or by train. Rats attacked the inmates, and the dead rats were often eaten by starving prisoners. It was at Bergen-Belsen at the age of 5.5 that I learned how to organize. Organizing meant to steal anything I could find from the other prisoners. During air raids, which were very frequent at Bergen-Belsen, while most of the prisoners hid in the latrines, we kids would sneak away from our parents into the other barracks and steal pieces of stale, molded and infested pieces of bread or anything else we could get our hands on. Most of our meals consisted of turnips, which to this day I can't eat, or some kind of liquid stuffed with matches and other strange objects that the Nazis called soup. This was accompanied by brown dishwater-like liquid, which they say was coffee. We washed in freezing cold weather since the only water supply was outside. One time, in exchange for a piece of moldy bread, my mother received an old tattered blanket from another prisoner, which was then made into a sort of jumpsuit to keep me warm during the endless hours of roll calls in freezing weather. We were all extremely undernourished and barely clothed. If at all, my jumpsuit quickly became filthy when I was forced to relieve myself while wearing it when I could no longer wait to use the latrines. The jumpsuit was closed tightly around my neck with a hood, and that's why nowadays I can't wear any clothing that has a high neckline such as turtlenecks. Our sleeping quarters were barracks with 3-level bunks, which, if you were lucky, were sometimes filled with a mattress of hay. We would lay like sardines, packed in tightly, at all hours of the day or night. The camp leader would walk in and check if the barracks were kept in order. My mother and I slept on the bottom level of one of the bunks, and very often waste would fall from the 3rd and 2nd level. When someone died in the barrack, their body was taken outside. Corpses soon became a common sight, and people didn't take the slightest bit of notice as the corpses began to pile up and decompose right before our eyes. Disease such as typhus raged through the camp because it was transmitted by lice. The Nazis ordered that all inmates had to have their heads shaved, so there were my beautiful blonde curly locks. We also developed large festering wounds on our bodies, which would not heal, and suffered from frostbite because of the cold weather. Food became scarce, and we would sometimes go days without any food at all. Fights among the prisoners were common as they began to go crazy because of their surroundings and the conditions in which they were being kept. Many prisoners were so desperate to be free that they deliberately ran into the electrically charged barbed wire fences that surrounded the camp to commit suicide. Afterwards, we would see their dead bodies hanging on the fences. At the age of 6, my playground consisted of a shed that was used as a mortuary, where the dead bodies were piled up before they went in the crematorium. It may sound odd, but the children in the camp found ways to amuse themselves. In spite of the horrors surrounding us because we were children, our spirits could not be completely squashed. Our games, of course, were not the usual games that children play. Our games were much more morbid because of our circumstances. In one game, my friend and I would gather little stones which we flicked into the open mouth of the dead corpses. The child who succeeded in reaching the target the most times was the winner. One day we had found a fully equipped doctor's bag with a stethoscope, syringes, etc. under the barracks. We filled the syringes with water and sprayed the other prisoners with it. We had a lot of fun. My mother worked in the children's barrack, and we were fortunate not to be separated from each other as so many of our children had been separated from their parents. But every day, my circle of friends became smaller and smaller. During roll calls, my friends' names were called and they were taken away, never to be seen again. Much later, we learned that they had been sent to other camps and killed. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen's thousands of inmates were beaten and abused. There was no medical attention and epidemics broke out. Among the prisoners who died at Bergen-Belsen were Anne Frank and her sister Margot, who both died just a few months before the camp was liberated. In April of 1945, 3 months before my 7th birthday, the end of the war drew near. Because the Allied troops were approaching fast, Bergen-Belsen had to be evacuated as the Nazis tried to get rid of their crimes, the evidence of their crimes. The camp administration broke down, the food supply was cut off, roll calls were stopped, and the starving inmates were left to their own devices. The thousands of corpses were tossed into mass graves, which to this day stand as enormous mounds on the grounds of Bergen-Belsen. The Nazis decided to put some of the surviving prisoners on trains and transport them to various destinations. After a long walk in the snow, which has been referred to in the history books as the Death March, because so many prisoners did not survive, and we were left for dead on the side of the road, or shot if they didn't walk fast enough, we reached the train station in the German town of Celle. 3 trains left the station. 1 train reached the concentration camp Theresienstadt in Poland, while another was liberated by the American troops. The 3rd train, with 2,500 prisoners on board, including my mother and me, drove for 14 days and nights between Berlin and Leipzig. There was no food or water on board, and many of the prisoners died on the train all around us. We were finally liberated on April 25th, 1945, from the train by Allied troops in a town in Germany called Tröbitz, now called Torgau. After we were liberated, my mother and I were treated for various illnesses. It was while I was at a hospital in Tröbitz that I saw something beautiful for the first time. It stood tall and had a beautiful yellow color to it. I crept out of my room and pulled the beautiful thing from the ground to bring it to my mother. When I reached her hospital room, I presented it to her and learned that that thing I was holding was called a flower, something I had never heard or seen before. To this day, whenever I give someone flowers, there's always one yellow one in the bunch. It's my trademark. Eventually, my mother and I were reunited with my father when we returned to Holland. He had been stationed in the army in England the entire time of the war, and I had found it difficult to accept him back in our lives because he had become a stranger to me. In 1946, a year after the war ended, my sister was born. A happy occasion for me because this was the first time in my life that I had something that was all mine and no one would take it away from me. In all, by the time the war ended, I lost more than 200 people, 200 loved ones on my mother's and father's side of the family. My paternal grandparents were killed in the gas chambers in Auschwitz, as were my father's brother, sister-in-law, and their newborn baby. On my mother's side, my grandmother had also been gassed at Auschwitz. Years later, we found out that my mother's father had died in Bergen-Belsen on the same day that my mother and I had been transported to Bergen-Belsen. I still suffer from quite frequently from panic attacks and have difficulty being in crowded rooms for fear that I cannot get out if I need or want to. Each day I take medication to help me get through the day. While the German government was forced to pay restitution to the countries invaded during the war to help those who had suffered under the Nazis' rule, the Dutch government only paid those funds to those survivors who had kept their Dutch nationality. For various reasons, many Jews had left Holland after the war, changed their nationalities. Many of them were afraid to stay in Europe for fear that another Holocaust would happen again. I was one of those people who had changed my nationality. I became an American citizen in 1970. But just because we moved away from Holland and changed our nationalities, didn't mean we no longer suffered psychologically, emotionally, and physically because of what we had been through. We needed help. So I formed a committee of former Dutch citizens persecuted during the Holocaust to fight to change the law that excluded us from receiving pensions for the suffering. In 1975, I won that fight. Since then, the Dutch government had paid restitution to those of us around the world who were Dutch citizens during and at the time that we were interned in a concentration camp or forced into hiding during the Holocaust. I continue to be the president of the organization, and I continue to fight on behalf of all survivors. Years ago, my daughter and I made a documentary-style movie about my life story. We traveled back to Germany and Bergen-Belsen and the town in which I was liberated. It was a moving experience for both of us. The only sad part was that we were unable to share that experience with my parents or my sister, all of whom have passed away. I would like to thank you again for this opportunity to speak to you today. I hope that my story has given you a glimpse of what it was like for us during the war. And I hope that in the future you will all learn to look past people's religion, skin colors, ethnic backgrounds, and sexual preferences to realize that we are all human beings. No one has the right to assume that they are better than anyone else. Nor do they have the right to brutalize those who are different from them. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions?
I think in the back somebody is there.
How old is your sister?
You have to speak up, okay?
How old is your sister?
How old?
My sister was 43 years young when she passed away in 1990. And I see here somebody with pink fight like a knight. My sister died of breast cancer. She didn't take care of it, and At age 43, she passed away. Thank you for wearing this, by the way. We should all be aware of that. Anybody else?
Did you ever come in contact with Hitler? Like, did you ever like?
No. Otherwise, he would not have lived longer than I did.
What type of flower was it that you picked up?
That was a kind of a daisy. At that time, you know, it's a what was it? A dandelion. It was like one of the wild flowers. Yeah. Yes.
How old were you when you were able to start speaking about this experience?
Oh, I started to do this only when I was in my 30s, when I was in the United States. Because in Europe, I didn't dare to talk about it, and at home, we couldn't talk about it. Only when my father was not around that I could talk with my mother, and thank God she told me a lot of things. Although I was very young, I remembered sometimes more things than my mother did, because these were my formative years that I was there. So.
How many days did you survive that year?
How many days?
Did you survive that year?
I can't hear you, sorry.
How many days did you survive that year?
Well, in the train it was 14 days and nights. We had no food. And we had, the water came from the icicles that were hanging on the train under the window.
Could you just repeat that
excuse
with
me.
the microphone?
The question was, how many days did I survive without food? Well, those food in the camp was very we had very little food, and later on in the train it was 2 weeks without food and water, and the water came from icicles that were hanging on the windows from the train.
Did you watch any of the Hollywoodized Holocaust movies?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Do you feel like they're pretty accurate?
Yes, the first one that the real one that I saw was Steven Spielberg's movie. Yeah, and that was really very good, because the little girl in the red coat, that could have been me. Anybody else?
Do you have any memories that stand out?
Yes, yes. One of them, I have many, but one of them is when we were in the death train for the 2 weeks. The train was bombed all the time, so they stopped the train and until it was over. But then the prisoners, among them my mom and myself, they jumped out of the train, and then my mother would fall over me, and I would start crying, and my mother would say, "Don't cry, because when we go together." And there is a little story to this that my daughter told me. When we had the earthquake, the big one, some years ago in Los Angeles, I grabbed my daughter and I stood there, and of course it was dark, and I said, "Don't be afraid, because when we go together." I didn't remember saying it, but my daughter did. And by the way, if nobody knows, this is my daughter Danielle, second generation Holocaust survivor. Anybody else?
So your sister wasn't in the Holocaust at all?
No, she was born in 1946, after the war. Excuse me? Yeah, after the war, 1946. The war ended in 1945. My sister was born a year later, after my father came back from the army.
The movie you and your daughter made, what's it called?
Journey Without End. It's mostly in Dutch. It was done by an English company, German company. It started in Los Angeles, and it has to do also with second generation, because the children of Holocaust survivors, and in Europe they're already on the third and the fourth generation, they do suffer too. because of their parents or grandparents that went through the war. So it's called Journey Without End. Yes. Anybody else?
How long after you became an American citizen did you return to Germany?
Oh, that was when we made the film in 1995. No, I was there before, I'm sorry. I needed to go and walk the route that my mother and I walked, the Death March. I went with my parents at the time. My sister didn't want to go in, but then in 1995 I took my daughter there, and I think that was the first and the last time she wanted to go because she couldn't handle it. And I felt pretty good because I felt like I was close. It was like a closure, and I was close to the family that had walked there with me.
How old were you? How old were you
When I went into the camps, 5.5. And when I was almost 7. Yeah. Yes. I saw some hands there.
What were the names of some of the camps you were in?
I was in Westerbork, Westerb like in boy O-R-K, which is in the northern part of Holland, and Bergen-Belsen. I don't know how many people read the Diary of Anne Frank, but that's where Anne Frank died, or her sister died too, just a few months before the liberation of the camp.
Were you happy with the results of the Nuremberg trials?
I was very young when that happened, but yes, I was. I read it later. I had to read about it because, yes, I couldn't read. I started to read at a very late age and write, of course. And, yeah. Anybody else?
Did you ever saw Anne Frank?
No, I did not. No, I never saw Anne Frank. First of all, Anne Frank came at almost at the end of the war from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. She's 8 years older than I was. And no, I did, though, he was a honorary member of my committee, Simon Wiesenthal, who was the Nazi hunter. I did meet him a couple of times, and he was a very, very nice person. Yes. In the back, yes? I can't hear, sorry.
Why did Germany feel this to the Jews?
It was not only to the Jews. I mean, he had in mind it was the Jews, only for the Jews. But later on, as I had said in my speech, it was homosexuals, there were other people, there were Christian people who helped the Jews. That's why I do not like to speak about 6 million Jews. There were, as far as we know, 12 million people murdered during the Holocaust. And that's why I ask all of you to respect each other, and that it doesn't happen again. You should never know of this here.
What was the worst part or the scariest part?
All those years that I was in prison, that I was in the camps, but after the war, long after the war, we only got, all these like what they call now post-traumatic stress syndromes and all these things that we never knew about it, and we didn't have any medication, but it was every day to be imprisoned in a camp or wherever. That is scary. It's very, and for sure for children. Excuse me.
Have you met any other Holocaust survivors?
Oh yes, I have my committee that is called the Committee of Former Dutch Holocaust Survivors, and I meet regularly with those who are still among us. A lot of them are in their 90s. I am we have also people in their 80s, but I'm one of the younger survivors. Yes, we meet regularly, and sometimes I cook for them, or just go, and talk to them. I talk to them on a daily basis, as a matter of fact. We call each other. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Is it? I thought Holland was supposed to be considered safer. That's why your grandparents moved there. So why did it get moved to?
Holland was bombed. Rotterdam, the city of Rotterdam, was bombed the first day of the war. And Holland, apparently, as the history books tell you, that Holland was very good during the war. Had a lot of people went into hiding in Holland. If you compare Holland with Poland, for instance, Poland is extremely large. Holland is a tiny little country. Percentage-wise, more Jews from Holland were killed than from Poland. So, yes.
Are you still friends with any of your friends from like the camp?
No, I don't have anybody, I think, who was in my camp that I still talk to, but there were, either mostly were hidden, or older people that were in Auschwitz and so on, and that they are members of my committee. Because in 1970, when I changed the law, when the law was changed in 1975, all these former Dutch Holocaust survivors came to me, and I still help them, the ones that are still among us, filling out their papers to getting the restitution, getting the medication paid. Not all of it, it had to do with the war and what have you. But yes, we do keep in touch, most of us, the ones that are still there.
Did you ever think you're gonna die for sure? At one moment?
Excuse me?
At what point did you ever think you're gonna die?
Did you ever think you were gonna die? Oh yes, yes. Yes, because when we were at the Appelplatz, that they say, where we had to get together, all of us, they would take the children from their mothers and fathers, and those children never came back to the barracks at night. So I was also afraid that I would be taken away from my mother, and but thank God that never happened, and we were very close. My mother passed away in 1994, and I'm the last one of the family that survived the camps. Oh yes, I have a lady who lives in Studio City. You were talking about Dr. Mengele, right? In Auschwitz, yes. She's 91 years old. Talk to her every day. And then I know other people. There is one lady who lives in Downey, but she lost her memory. She is, at the moment, I haven't seen her in a long time, but she was also a Dr. Mengele, yes, yes. Excuse me, say that a little louder, please.
Do you have anything from your time in concentration camp?
You mean that as personal belongings or things? No, I don't have that. No. I have one Jewish star that we had to wear on our clothing, but that I have at home. I forgot to mention also one thing, that a few years ago, I was knighted by the Queen of the Netherlands for the work that I'm doing with the Holocaust survivors. And that was, I think, about 9 years ago, and we went to Holland, and that story I just gave to Dr. You have that story, so that is what and I will do this as long as I can. I'm not 18 years old anymore, and it's getting a little bit harder. But we'll do it, and I will do it mostly for you, the younger people, because I don't want you to go ever, never go through this here.